think we should get started. I am super excited to be here with Jess Anthony and Kate Christensen and all of you. This is the Portland Public Library's event in celebration of Jess Anthony's book, Enter the Aardvark, which came out at the end of March. The way that today's event is going to work is Jess and Kate will talk for 45 minutes or so. We're hoping that throughout the entire hour that everyone will remain muted, but I'd love to field questions from any of you via the chat feature. And you can type your questions in, and then I will relay them to the writers. And let's see, the only other thing that I wanted to mention is that this terrific book is obviously for sale now, and the good folks at Longfellow Books are standing by their phones and would love to take your order and can send you a copy of the book. Their phone number is 207-772-4045. So place an order and get this good book. Kate Christensen is the author of 9 books, most recently The Last Cruise. She lives in Maine, but she's currently in New Mexico, and hopefully we'll get her back soon. Jess Anthony is the author of The Convalescent, and also the multimedia novel Chopsticks, and her new novel, which is receiving great acclaim and lots of wonderful reviews and is loved by everybody who has read it, is called Enter the Aardvark. And like I said, it came out just recently.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Aardvark, just to get the conversation going. I want this conversation to be Aardvark-centric, not only because it just came out and I'm excited to talk to Jess about it, but I feel that it's a book for right now. And that doesn't always happen. That's some kind of magic. And I know that it was a long time in the writing. And so I'm hoping we'll get to talk about how writers have their antenna out all the time and what that's feeling like right now during this pandemic. So first of all, I want to hold it up too so you can see the wonderful cover. I think it's probably backwards, and I apologize for that. Maybe, is it?
Or is I actually think it looks good. I think that's right.
Awesome.
Yeah.
The reason I'm holding it up is that I want to talk about the aardvark itself as a symbol. And this book is a maximalist novella. And it's one of those books, one of those very, very rare books that you read at kind of gulping air in utter astonishment at what a tour de force it is, at the same time that you're moved and laughing and thinking and fully engaged. It's such a brilliant book, Jess. The thing that feels particularly timely to me about it is the symbol of the aardvark itself, which is described as a hybrid sort of a pig and a raptor. The cover makes a sort of elephant donkey joke that I think is really appropriate, and I think there's so much in this book that I want to unpack, but I also, it's like when you read a perfect thing, you want it to just sit there and shimmer and be itself. And I want you all to read it because talking about it won't do it justice. But I feel like it's about evolution, it's about creation, it's about rebirth and life, it's about political reality now and Victorian science, which come together in a really interesting way. There's the whole idea of taxidermy and the discovery of new species that was going on in the Victorian era. And the way animals were just shipped back to England to be taxidermied and shown and put on display, the idea of nature as a kind of civilizing nature and turning it into a curiosity, and the human interaction with nature in the Victorian era somehow relates to our political climate in a really interesting way, because it's like a double helix of a story. The narrative goes back and forth, and the book is structured between two gay couples, two sets of gay men, both of whom are closeted, one in Victorian England and Namibia, and the other in 21st century DC in some beautiful world in which there's a democratic president and politicians for their actions. And in fact, it feels like a really optimistic book right now because of the political climate that the book is centered in. So I want to, later on, after Jess reads a little from the book, I want to talk about all of these things and maybe get a portrait of the artist as a young Jess, because as I read this book, I thought, it feels like this book just came out of your head, fully formed. And I know that's not true because I'm a writer myself, and I know how much work goes into making it look so dazzling. So I kind of want to, so we'll get back to this after you read, but as I was, and it's a very moving book and a very funny book at the same time, as well as sort of a stylistic feat of, writerly accomplishment. And and it's funny to read a book by your friend, and Jess and I have been friends for years. And hi, Jess, it's really good to see you. But it's interesting to read a book by your friend and to feel like there is this whole component. I've never really talked to you about your childhood. I've never really talked about where you came from as a writer. So why don't you read from the book and let's talk?
Yeah, thank you, Kate, so much for that amazing intro. I think that's probably the most accurate description in a way that you can possibly try and describe this novel. I think that you really brought together all of the things that I was thinking about writing the story. Thank you for that. That was brilliant. And I also have to say to everyone, I actually was first introduced to Kate through her own novels. I was working at Casco Bay Books a long time ago on Middle Street as slinging coffee, and there also was a bookstore. And I noticed at one point in the bookstore that there were all of these displays of all of these really wonderful, but male writers. And I said, well, wait a minute, we need to make this better. We need to fix this. So out went the John Updike. And in came, I actually created a display of Kate's novels when I was working as a bookseller. So to be able to be here today with Kate is a huge honor for me. And I'm so thrilled. Thanks for doing this with me, Kate. So folks, I thought I would just read a little bit from the opening of the novel. I'd like to give you a taste of both sections. As Kate said, there are two narrative strands that run through this book. The central principle of Enter the Aardvark is the arrival of a gigantic taxidermied aardvark on the doorstep of a young millennial congressman named Alexander Payne Wilson, he's a GOP congressman and he's running for re-election. And this stuffed aardvark lands on his front doorstep that ends up bringing down his entire re-election campaign. So that is the present day narrative. And then, yes, as Kate said, we also go into the story of the taxidermist who stuffed the aardvark. And so the aardvark kind of exists in these two time periods. So I'm going to give you guys just a little bit of a taste of each of those narratives. We are going to start with Titus Downing, who is the Victorian taxidermist who stuffed the aardvark. And he has just received the aardvark carcass from his lover, a British naturalist named Richard Oslet, who has sent him the carcass from Namibia. And so he is just trying to kind of cope with this strange, creature that's just arrived on his doorstep. Titus Downing, consciously unmarried, consciously childless, aficionado not only of taxidermy, but also of very fine, very thin oxtail soup, gazes at the humped back and smooth neck, the fat claws, the ears and snout so oddly long it looks like someone pulled them, and shudders. Next to the Bengal tiger, this so-called aardvark is a truly vulgar creature, he thinks, ugly even for nature, like a pig screwed a donkey, and immediately reminds Downing of a story famous among taxidermists, that of Captain John Hunter, who in 1798 sent the first skin and sketch of a platypus to naturalists in England, who in turn assumed it was a hoax, They thought someone had sewn a duck's bill onto a beaver pelt, going so far as to write that upon viewing the creature, it is impossible not to entertain doubts, and all surmise that there might have been practiced some art of deception, which is why Downing, wondering if his close friend Richard Oslet could have sent him a hoax, inspects the skin for unnatural seams and finds that there are no unnatural seams. Downing returns to his workbench. He closes his eyes and tries to quiet himself back into the life of the Bengal tiger, but it is impossible. The tiger's moment is past. It will likely take days to find it again, and his mind is traveling helplessly back to the Aardvark until at last he gives up and goes to it, realizing with growing excitement that Oslet has offered him not a joke, but a challenge. How to recreate the jiva of a beast as ugly as this one, a creature about which no civilized man knows anything. The notes and sketches which Oslet has sent him now appear to Downing to be almost deliberately sparse. Nocturnal, sleeps in underground tunnels, eusocial entomological eater, has cheek teeth, throws snout into ground to smell deeply, digs with front feet, kicks dirt with back feet, bark is high-pitched, such as a wanting dog, exit the tiger, enter the aardvark. Downing's bony fingers cross the pelage. The skin is first pink and then yellow, the fur an inexplicable mixture of wire and silk, and it's brown at the hind limbs, which are plantigrade at the front, digitigrade at the back, and Osler's hunters always do a very fine job, he thinks, as his hands touch the beast's rear feet, which take up half the leg. Then it's the heavy claws, each digit wide as a spoon, and what strength in the tail, Downing thinks, how it glides right up the back, which is round as a tortoise, and he closes his eyes and imagines the aardvark using the tail muscle for balance in her underground tunnels to avoid bumping her wide body into narrow walls. And Downing can now clearly see the aardvark lumbering on her large legs past huge termite mounds. They look like sand castles built by ambitious, imbecilic children. And there's the great hulk of shoulder gliding beneath the skin, the fat swing of belly. And Downing now knows her weight and pesanteur, her erratic mood. And when she runs, she rises surprisingly up onto her tippy toes, so much so she fairly prances, her conical head aloft with donkey ears that flick upward at any rustle of subterranean insect activity. And he can almost feel the scrabble of the loose soil as she thrusts her spoons into the earth to begin burrowing. The dirt smells of sugar. He can almost taste the nectar of termites now on his own sticky tongue until morning arrives and enter the bark, the soft piggy squeal, "Don't wake me in daylight." Enter the fatigue, bones burning after a night ambling on these bizarre haunches, and when she sleeps, she curls her fat body into a comma, and Downing can now feel the light purr of the beast's slimy lips during slumber, her nostrils shuddering open then closed, and there goes the slip of the serpentine tongue in and out from her small mouth as she dreams about her own hunger, and it is now, because Downing can see into the dreams of the ugly, vulgar, exhausted aardvark, that he begins to understand that despite its appalling morphology, beauty is possible. So then we move into the present day, where we are going to follow Alexander Payne Wilson, who, oh, thank you. Oh my goodness. Where we're going to follow Alex Payne Wilson, who has just realized that the gigantic taxidermic aardvark, of course, is the self-same stuffed aardvark that sits upon a dresser in his lover's bedroom, and his lover is Greg Tampico. And so he's just texted Greg Tampico, wondering why Greg Tampico has sent him this gigantic stuffed aardvark. And here we go. Greg Tampico does not text back. Greg Tampico always texts back. A chill creeps your neck as the stuffed aardvark standing underneath a floor lamp watches you pace in your living room. The way it's mounted, the front right claw slightly lifted, the long snouted head slightly askew, ears alert, akimbo. The aardvark appears to be in the middle of walking to someplace important, like you've interrupted it doing its job. And the last thing you need to feel right now is that you are like bothering somebody in your own house with the creature's expression, while you never thought about it much in Greg Tampico's walk-up. Here in your living room with your furniture precisely chosen to look like a townhouse Ronald Reagan might have enjoyed is now looking, let's face it, like incredibly odd. And you know that as soon as Congress is back in session and Representatives Rutledge and Holyoke are back in the townhouse, you will have to suffer their questions about the aardvark. And frankly, you have no idea what in the hell you're going to tell them. You go upstairs, you want to take a shower. Your shower is a Kohler Vibrant Brushed Bronze Water Tile Ambient Rain Overhead Rain Shower, which costs $4,125, so you like taking showers. The water is cold, it feels good, it's so hot out. You must be feeling this way from the heat, you think, and since Greg Tampico is not texting back, you decide while drying off with your $339 Hermes Sarcoline terry cloth body towel that the easiest solution is to drive the Aardvark to Alexandria and simply return it to him. Mother of God, you think, what a pain in the ass as you dress yourself head to toe in light casual summer wear from J. Crew. When you return to the living room, the Aardvark looks at you like you are ridiculous. Oh, no, you don't, you say. You have spoken out loud to a stuffed aardvark. You feel ridiculous. You go into the kitchen and eat a few grapes. While in the kitchen, which is floor-to-ceiling white subway tile decked out in $6,000 worth of Williams-Sonoma that you never use, an epiphany. You open a cabinet. You remove a flour sack. It is a clean white flour sack with a ragged edge to make it look vintage, and your decorator bought all these freaking flour sacks. You have no idea why, but they're folded like new t-shirts in a cabinet in your kitchen, so you grab one and go back to the living room. Though you feel stupid doing it, you cover the face of the aardvark with a flour sack. Then, using your back and your knees like your old gym teacher taught you, you actually hoist the bastard, carrying it downstairs to the small dark garage of 2486 Asher Place, where your car, a black Chevy Tahoe, is waiting. You leased the Tahoe just a few weeks ago for $600 monthly, and how pleased are you that the Tahoe is already proving itself useful as you fling open the rear doors and pull down the back seats. Remarkably, the Aardvark fits. It's like the engineers planned it. The trunk, luxurious and roomy, can fit a whole African aardvark. You slam the doors, climb into the driver's seat, and turn on the AC in Soulja Boy full blast. You hit the garage door button, and the machine hums as the door rises. The garage floods with sunlight. You pull out onto the street, checking your phone. Though it's just 8:52 a.m., you now have 233 text messages and 97 emails, but this is, again, standard. You locate Greg Tampico's address on King Street in Alexandria, stab the GPS button, and are able to relax for the first time today as the Tahoe, worth every penny, knows what to do. And I'll stop there. Yay! I'm glad that worked. Good.
That was dazzling. My first thought as I'm listening to you read this is, where does this come from? And were you a writer as a little kid? Were you? I mean, I'm trying to imagine little Jess growing up and having this entire sort of crackling world in your brain that you now have turned into books. But is that the case?
You're awesome. I mean, look, I was a reader as a little kid. I mean, I think most writers who are kind of asked this question of where the work comes from, I mean, it really comes primarily out of just a love of books. I mean, I remember my parents used to stack books for me on my bed. In order to fall asleep, I sort of had to have a little fort of books. And I just loved reading. And my mother was a Latin teacher, and so she would read me Greek mythology at night, and I loved Greek stories, the Greek myths. And so, and stories were always just a part of my family. I mean, the Anthonys never really took themselves that seriously, Kate. And so there were just constant jokes. There was so much laughter. And, you always were trying to kind of, conjure the next story to tell, at the dinner table. And so I think that those kinds of experiences are, I mean, they're certainly formative, but I think it's also just, the luck of who I was sort of born into. I grieve for kids who really don't grow up in an environment where, where there's constant reading and sort of the reward of story. That was very much a part of my life. But I would also say that, into college and into the writing classroom, I mean, my first writing workshop I ever took was at the University of Manchester in fiction. So this was in England when I was a junior abroad in England. And I worked with the writers Michael Schmidt and Richard Francis. And the first story I submitted for a workshop, I remember the reaction specifically, I believe it was Michael Schmidt. Yeah, it was Michael Schmidt. And he said, "There are many problems with this story. I'm going to begin with the first 12. And he just started listing for me everything that I had done wrong in this fiction. And so, you know, they really don't care about your emotions in the UK and the way that we do in the United States in writing workshops. I mean, they're just going to tell you what's wrong with the fiction. So that was also quite a formative moment for me. I remember going back to my flat and feeling like horrible waves of pity, you know, and just self-doubt. But then I realized, well, I have two options. Either I can, you know, leave fiction behind, or I can get better. And so I chose to get better. And I discovered, you know, over the next 5-6 years, sort of working on my fiction on my own, that came through the sentence. It came through really just loving the sound of, you know, words in certain orders, certain dictions, certain syntaxes. I began to kind of understand that what writers are really doing is they are, you know, they're talking to themselves, you know. So as a fiction writer, I'm telling myself the story that I desperately want to hear, that I desperately want to read. I'm sure you feel the same way, Kate, when you're writing story. I mean, I don't want to assume, but is that how you write as well?
Right. That's exactly right. And it's sort of this voice in your own head that you're sort of manifesting publicly, which is terrifying. And so having that little bath in British dispassion was probably the best thing that could have happened to you, because I don't think they have safe spaces in UK writing workshops, I'm imagining.
Well, yeah, I mean, a safe space, the way that I view a safe space is that, you know, you can offer up any degree of radical idea, right, in the conversation that you want, and you know that no one is going to, you know, gun you down for speaking your mind, for having an opinion. That, in my view, is a safe space. But certainly that doesn't mean that that strategy works for everybody. And I would just say, I mean, I teach creative writing, I have for years, and that is not necessarily the method that I use, you know, to teach stories. At least I'm not sure that my students would return to me if they did, if I did. But for me personally, it was a method that worked. And you know, in some ways, I think you need to be shaken a little bit. You need to kind of wake up and realize that just because you wrote something, well, good for you, but you know, it's a draft. You know, what you really have to do as a writer is learn to love the process and the work itself. If you can fall in love with the work of fiction, I can't imagine that there's anything that's going to get in your way if it's what you want, you know? No. But it's a big ask, right? Because that's something that can't be taught, right? I can't teach you to be addicted to your fiction and to love it, you know, and to need it. Yeah.
That's exactly right. It's a sense of necessity, the act of writing itself. And the idea that whatever's happening in the world, you have your antenna sort of
yes,
creepily sort of in every crevice. You know, like reading, like, I feel like writers are sort of spider-like, sitting in our little web, vibrations on the web of every lumbering insect that comes in and then sucking it dry and trussing it up. I mean, there is something rapacious about writing.
It's true.
And that whatever, but I feel like, I mean, why don't we talk a little bit about the writing of this particular book?
Yeah.
Because I feel that it's so timely and so necessary right now to read this book in so many ways, but you didn't write it in this climate. So how were your antenna picking up sort of what was happening, and how were you responding as you wrote the book? Yeah,
I mean, just knowing that the GOP frontrunner was Donald Trump was enough. I mean, I wrote the first draft of this novel very quickly in the summer of 2015, and the energy and just sort of the voice and so much of kind of what you know, the rest of the book like kind of circumnavigates around, that sort of essential core notion was created the summer of 2015, you know, in the run-up, right, to the 2016 election. And so, you know, I would just say that I was alert and thinking about problems of social media, problems of just kind of the way that I was seeing language being discussed on social media, political language being discussed on social media, and just kind of imagining, you know, this collision of millennial speech. I'm sure you heard in the contemporary section of the novel that Alexander Payne Wilson, you know, drops likes constantly. He has the you know, the Valley Girl affect. I think that, you know, I mean, look, I love millennials. I'm generalizing here, but, you know, there's a cliche about millennial speech that they sort of sound like Valley girls who went to business school, you know? And so I'm thinking of Alex Wilson's, you know, speech affect in collision with Washington, D.C. and the sort of the absurdity of the political landscape that was even beginning to appear in 2015. And now, as here we are in 2020, when, my goodness, it's like in 5 years, the world has changed so dramatically. Even in the last 6 weeks, the world has changed so dramatically. I would just say that it's been a rather frightening experience to watch the way in which the absurdity of the novel has become a kind of reality. The lampoon and the hyperbole and the exaggeration of the satire has kind of transmogrified into this chilling reality that really offers a different kind of commentary. And I've been talking about it a little bit like the way we might feel watching Tina Fey perform Sarah Palin, you know, and just reading Sarah Palin's actual words on SNL. It's satire, but it's also, because it's true, there's something even more savage about it, right? So it's almost like a different kind of parody. And I felt in some ways that's now kind of the reaction you know, some readers are feeling reading this novel is like, this feels so true. So there's this kind of, there's an overarching kind of eye. There's a new way of looking at this material that has emerged. And, you know, even in the last 6 weeks. I've been actually going back to this quote by Grace Paley, which just rings so true to me right now. It's that we are in the hands of men whose wealth and power have divorced them from the reality of daily life and the imagination. So we have a right to be afraid. And I feel like that concept, I mean, we're feeling that every day now as we see you know, decisions being made, you know, by the national government, even by certain state governments, you know, by certain governors across the US that really are putting our lives at risk, right? So underneath the kind of satiric overlay and the comedy and the kind of pointed finger at a guy like Alex Wilson, he's just here on earth to please Mitch McConnell, you know, there are grave stakes. He is actually not only in a process of personal self-investigation, we actually as a society are finding ourselves having to wait for him to get it right. And I guess one of the questions that this novel is asking is, how long are we willing to wait for these fellows to publicly fail? At what point does our empathic compass kind of, you know, force itself to go back and point towards ourselves and ask what it is that we really need? And I think as women in America, we're sick to death of it, right? I mean, here we are in 2020, and we're fighting these battles that supposedly were supposed to be, you know, completed with Roe v. Wade. And no, I mean, here we are. We have this pandemic and we have problems of reproductive rights being curtailed, you know, for reasons that are purportedly about the pandemic because they're calling them non-essential procedures. I mean, so, you know, we're talking about basic freedom here for half of America, for half the planet. I mean, these stakes couldn't be bigger, it seems to me. So in a way, I mean, I love that you're saying the novel is speaking to this moment, because it certainly does, but the way that it's changed, Kate, has really been a chilling experience for me, I have to say. Yeah.
I'm sure even you with your prodigious imagination could not have pictured where we would be right now.
Oh, no.
No.
No. I don't think anybody could. Well, I mean, there were a few people in the know, but they kept it from us. I mean, Obama tried. He warned us, he tried. No, I think, you know, there are some novelists who actually have, you know, pandemic novels coming out, you know, sort of sci-fi. So, I mean, it would be interesting to talk to them about, you know, publishing a sci-fi novel about a pandemic in this moment. I mean, that would be crazy.
It kind of takes the sigh out of fi.
Yeah, right.
But one of the things that's remarkable about this book is that it's satirical, and I think we can all hear the satire in the you, the second person of this you know, little GOP rising star who's a closeted homosexual and anti-gay, and in the sort of, it reminded me of American Psycho, the way that you listed the price and the object. And this book is very, very, very precise about objects. And And as much as it is about language, it's also about the specificity and the importance of actual objects, which I love. It's kind of, it's not done a lot. But so while that you is very pointed and very funny and very scathing in a way, it's also very empathetic. And
yeah.
It's a double, and the second person works so beautifully. It's so risky. So much about this book is risky, including how short it is and how big it is at the same time. But one of the things I wanted to talk about is the love story, and the fact that it's a double love story, and that both love stories are strangely moving. You don't expect it. It kind of sneaks up on you with this rollicking, the voice, that this language that just, I mean, as you all could hear, as Jess read, it's a book about creativity and language and sort of, I think, writing itself. I mean, I saw a lot of parallels. I saw the aardvark as this symbol of so much, but including a catalyst for the entire novel. It's the inciting incident of the novel. It's the catalyst for the love affairs, both love affairs. But it's also, as you say, this animal that predated us and will live on long after. And it's this unlikely hybrid of so many things. It's, what is an aardvark? It's, you know, it's, and I thought, I wonder if you were always obsessed with aardvarks. I was obsessed with penguins when I was in junior high, and I had this image of you as like a 12-year-old. Aardvarks and laughing. But to get back to the book, I feel like there is a moral, strong kind of sense of right in this voice, but also the idea of wearing the skins of your enemies, which writers do, and which you do in your portrait of Alex. And so I feel like you were putting on the skin of this GOP congressman and wearing it in the book. And I'm wondering what that was like for you, what that experience was like to empathize as and point fingers at simultaneously this person that is so different from you.
Oh, I love that you made that corollary, Kate. That you're the first person who said that to me. It's so great. It's so accurate. I love that. I'm not surprised that you're the one who gets it. Yeah, I mean, I would just say it was a huge amount of fun. You know, we forget that writing fiction, it's a lot of fun, folks. It should be fun. You should be just, you know, going to the outer edge of the envelope and just constantly seeing how much you can kind of get away with in story. I mean, I really love the play of fiction. I don't love gimmick in fiction. I'm not trying to say that, like, I would inhabit a certain character, you know, for some kind of game with myself. Writing Alex Wilson felt like an emotionally true and an empathically true choice of character as I was writing him. Otherwise, I wouldn't have continued him. But I also had such a blast. I mean, imagining, you know, the life of this, I mean, it's only 12:34 p.m., but I'm just going to drop the bomb douchebag. I mean, the guy is the worst. But I mean, that's what, in fiction, that's can often be where the fun is, to write those characters who are villainous, who are flawed. I mean, I think there's been a little bit of a hesitancy to occupy those kinds of psyches because people are concerned about various questions of appropriation. But what makes Alex Wilson work, at least in my mind, is that he's a human being. And, you know, we're able to empathize with him, hopefully, at least in some capacity, by the end of the novel, because what happens to him is so profoundly sad and it's so profoundly human. To try and put yourself in the shoes of a man who, you know, sees his entire political career taken down in roughly 24 hours and then finds, I mean, I'm going to maybe spill some beans here, but finds a great deal of personal loss as well as he's coming to terms with how strongly he felt about his lover. I mean, this is, these are common things that we all share. And you well know, Kate, that when you're writing story, you are writing the emotional truth of your characters. And when you're occupying the psyches and the personas of other characters, you know, a lot of it is landscape. I know that sounds like a little bit of a cynical view, but you have to decide the degree to which you're interested in, you know, the exterior components of who your character is, But I mean, and that's, you know, I'm interested in Alex Wilson because he's completely vain. He's completely ambitious. He worships Ronald Reagan. So like, you know, we're taking this idea of, you know, of Reagan worship in the GOP and we're just blowing it up. So he actually collects the clothes that Reagan, you know, wore and the furniture that Reagan actually had. And so, you know, doing that was just a huge amount of fun to kind of imagine, you know, this guy who has a lot of money and he's doing all the wrong things with it. I mean, you know, I think if you look at how, you know, young kids like to tell stories, you know, they constantly hyperbolize, they constantly blow things out of proportion. And they also love to, you know, tell stories outside of, you know, the strict autobiography of their own experience. And then at some point along the way, we become a little bit less comfortable doing so. But I think, you know, I go back to Zadie Smith, who wrote a great essay called In Defense of Fiction. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it, but, you know, she really makes the case that, you know, novelists, you know, they occupy these spaces for a reason. You know, it's the reason that James Baldwin would say, simply to tell the truth. He, you know, Baldwin says that writers and poets are the ones who are able to tell the truth of us, you know, of the story of humanity better than anybody else can, because we're able to kind of access a certain truth that has nothing to do with the costume of being the person that you are. So like the costume of Jess Anthony is this, you know, middle-aged woman who grew up in upstate New York in a tiny little town. You know, it had a Latin teacher as a mother and a, you know, opera singer and college administrator as a father, you know, and I have a sister who is a Republican. My sister voted for Trump. And so there are all of these kinds of literal truths about my own experience that I personally, at least not yet, would not feel like interpreting in story. I think there's like a magic that happens, at least for me, when I'm able to kind of put myself into the shoes of another and just imagine all the different ways that I relate to them, sort of, you know, emotionally. And I'll also say that there's, you know, if I were to write the character of a middle-aged woman in upstate New York who grew up in those exact terms and those exact circumstances, I would have no idea as a novelist who she really was, right? I mean, she would be a person who was so completely different from me because she isn't me, right? And so unless I were deliberately trying to write autofiction, which is its own kind of category nowadays, where people are kind of in a really kind of, it's in a provocative way, trying to blur the boundaries between the author's autobiography and sort of like a character that they're inhabiting. They're really like pressing the question of persona. You know, unless you're deliberately trying to do that, I stand by Coleridge's suspension of disbelief. And that to me is where the play is, right? To what degree can you to persuade your reader to forget themselves, right, as they're reading, you know?
And the writer, to forget.
And sorry, what?
To forget who wrote it, to not even think about the author.
Well, and isn't that the space that you want to inhabit when you're writing story, Kate? Like, you know that it's working when you don't even realize that you're alive and you're typing. You're so deep into the dream of the story that you're writing that you disappear. And that, you know, that's why I think so many of us are drawn to fiction, is that we are able to kind of drop into this place that's so rich and rewarding and fun. I mean, it's the highest form of entertainment. And hopefully that translates to the reader's subconscious, so the reader then gets to experience that same sensation of not even feeling as though they're turning the pages. They're so deeply immersed in a novel. I mean, I know that when I'm reading a fiction that does that to me, there's nothing like it, you know, and then you snap out of it and you sort of carry the novel with you all day. You know, it's such a great thing. I mean, this is what books can do that TV can't. I'm sorry. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe I just nerded out on everybody. I'm really sorry. I apologize, but
you know, and
I love this stuff.
When you're talking about empathizing with Alex, there's one line I wanted to bring up that just astonished me. It made me stop and reread it. And it was about how he was spending money, spending taxpayer money on himself because his mother didn't love him.
Yeah.
And he's treating the government like a parent who didn't love him, and he deserves that money.
Yeah.
And it first of all made so much sense. Like, I feel like, how many politicians feel that way? Probably a lot of them.
Mm-hmm.
But it made me empathize with him, a person I didn't want to empathize with. I thought, oh, that makes absolute sense. So that was a sort of, that's toward the end of the book, and that was a sort of spark of complete identification with him. Like that's why throughout the book, every single object he's bought is listed as its catalog listing and its price, because he deserves these things. And these things are totems. They have meaning. They substitute for his mother's love for him in a way, and they substitute for everything he didn't get in the world. And so what was satirical, what felt satirical and pointed, suddenly becomes humane, and for that moment of that sentence, moving unexpectedly, which really worked. And I also want to talk about another moment in the book, which stayed with me. It sort of just happens, and then it's over, and you never think about it again. But it's when Titus is a boy, and he's in a cave, and there's a muddy little girl who smells sweet and animal and musky, and she bites him.
Yeah.
What the actual hell? And I don't think it's referred to again in the book, but he has a scar that throbs between his knuckles. And again, to me, that was a moment in the book that just took me out of myself in a sort of daze of curiosity about this particular moment coming when it does, out of nowhere, and then receding into the past. It felt like this is what makes the book feel so maximalist, is that you were free as a writer to put that in and to have it reverberate without having to call attention to it or refer to it again. It's just sitting there as a strange but perfectly apropos incident. And so I want to talk a little bit about the book's maximalism and how big it feels. It's how long? 180 pages or something. And I read it first. The first time I read it was on was flying up from New York to Maine, which is a really short plane trip. Maybe it was Washington, D.C. Maybe I was leaving D.C. I can't remember, but I read it on an airplane, and I read it in the duration of the flight. So it must not have been New York to Maine. But it's one of those experiences in which I was reading it on my laptop and just pawing through. I mean, with a laptop, you actually paw through the pages. Like a hungry animal, like a pig with a hoof demanding. And so the plane took off and I started reading, and I had about 50 pages left as it landed. And I didn't want to get off the plane. I had that experience of being in this world that now I associate with an airplane ride, flight, in transit from one place to another, and coming down and coming out of the book and being somewhere else. And so that's and I've read it since, but I still get that feeling of being on an airplane ride. But it's a big book. And I don't expect you to explain to me how you did that, but I just want to remark on it. And it's a book that expands. It has these moments that sort of balloon in the mind as you read, and that sort of hang, you know, and by the end of the book, and it's taut. It doesn't feel, you know, you're kind of holding your breath as you read. But there's a sense at the end of this expansion of the book in my mind. And I don't know, this isn't a question. This is just.
Well, it's funny because, you know, we actually sold it to Hudson News, and because I think people wanted to sell this book specifically to people on airplanes, because you can actually read the novel on an airplane. And so Hudson News bought it, and we were all set, but then of course now no one's flying. No, I mean, Kate, what you're talking about, I think this maximalism, you know, to me is like a direct rebuttal to all of the awful gritty realism that we had to read in the 90s. And, you know, I just really resist, you know, like sort of, you know, the kind of the false presentation of quiet, realistic fiction to begin with. It's just not my style. It's not the sort of fiction that I really enjoy reading. I am a writer who needs to have two things working at the same time in order to believe it and drop into a fiction. And that is, I need the sentence and I need the story. I think the sentence actually is the story. I believe that I write actually syllabically. And so every sentence has a kind of a series of musical measures. And so I'm listening to the sound of the sentences as much as I'm just writing a fiction. And so I guess I would just say that I think that it's taken me a little bit of time. You know, earlier we talked about like how long it takes me to write. I mean, I'm actually quite a slow writer for this reason. It takes me a lot of time to hear the music of each sentence and have to return to it again and again and ensure that the composition is correct. And it also requires huge stretches of isolation and quiet immersion, to the detriment of my social life, my poor husband. I mean, some people have talked about this. I had to actually go on a 3-month residency away from my life. I went to rural Slovakia to guard a bridge. It's a whole story, folks. But all I'll say is like it was 3 quiet months to write. I mean, there's nowhere quieter on earth than rural Slovakia, I promise you. And so yeah, I mean, I guess those are just the terms that I've come to define that work for me. I know that everyone, has different terms and desires out of fiction, but for me, a fiction really comes alive at the sentence level. And so, when I write a sentence like, no one knows that you suck Greg Tampico's cock, which frankly, I'm not a person who I think is particularly ribald or raunchy, but I remember writing that sentence and just believing it and thinking that's accurate. No one does believe this. And so sort of the fact and the declaration of the voice and the irony in a line like that just made sense to me and it rang true. And so I began to trust that sound, if that makes sense. It's a huge amount of faith to finish a novel. I mean, I'm talking to the right person here. She who has written 9. Every time you enter into a world of fiction, it's a leap of faith. But maybe you can speak to this better than I can, Kate. I mean, somehow it happens and it works, and you have to fight through the sort of the quiet solitude and the madness to get yourself there, but you can do it, and it's there if you're patient with yourself. And if you're in my case, over the course of 6 years, extremely patient to have 180 pages at the end of it. So I mean, for those of you who are joining us who are interested in, writing story, I would just say that if you reach this place where you're feeling as though you're sort of hopeless about your work, you're kind of halfway through a book and you feel like it's slipping, apart at the seams, it's not working. I would just encourage you to go back to the most earliest moment in the novel where you believed in it, right? Where you heard the sound and it made sense to you and you were excited about the story that you were writing. And I would just, return to that place and then continue from there and see what happens. Yeah, so maybe we should ask if there are any questions. Should we do that?
Thanks so much. This has been amazing. Like, you guys are just killing it. I'm loving every minute of this. There have been a number of questions, and there are a few viewers, listeners, who are just kind of delighted and curious about both the object of the aardvark and the metaphor of the aardvark. And so this question was phrased in a couple of different ways, but first, which came to you first, the metaphor of the aardvark or the story? And then another viewer asked, when did the aardvark enter for you, like in the process of unearthing the story?
Yeah, so the word aardvark came to me before anything. I thought of the title back in 2012, Enter the Aardvark. I'll often write from titles. And there was something just really absurd about this phrase. It's something that the surrealist poet Andre Breton calls a waking sentence, where if you can capture a waking sentence as a writer, it means that there's something alive for you there. There's something woke about that sentence that you really want to chase. And so Enter the Aardvark was just this line I had in my head way back in 2012. And I sat with it for years until finally in 2015, I had the sense that I wanted to write a political novel. I wanted to engage politics in some way in story, had no idea how it was going to happen. And so I sat down and I wrote Enter the Aardvark, and A Whirling Mass of Vapors was unhinged. And that's the opening line that begins the long opening sentence of the novel, which is the evolution of the aardvark. I knew nothing about aardvarks, really, before I started writing this novel. I knew probably what the normal person knows about aardvarks, which is like, wait, aren't they anteaters? Like, what's the difference? Like, that's kind of all I knew. But, of course, it was a really exciting experience to research this animal. And in the research of the animal and kind of figuring out, a little bit about how the irrational appearance of the aardvark with their long snouts and their rabbity ears and this sort of kangaroo tail, how this sort of weird amalgam of all these other different animals, you know, made it feel unlikely and irrational, but yet it's the most evolutionarily, one of the most evolutionarily distinct creatures on Earth, which means it's been around since the Miocene. They haven't evolved, aardvarks, which is to say, you know, what a perfect parallel to the contemporary hypocritical politician. I mean, these guys have been around forever in all different kinds of capacities, right? And so the metaphor of the aardvark really naturally evolved out of the experience of simply studying the irrationality of the animal, if that makes sense. Yeah.
That's awesome. So Dave Patterson had a great kind of two-part question, and I think you've kind of answered part of
Hi,
both.
Dave. I just saw Dave in the woods.
Oh, did you? But the first, and you did a great job of describing just how you attend to the music of the sentences, and that. But I think he wanted to know a little bit more about, because he's like, how do you construct and sustain these acrobatic sentences throughout the novella? They're lush but accessible. Do they come out as you write, or are they labored over through reading out loud? So that's his question.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's an extraordinary amount of labor.
Yeah.
You just like any other writer, you know, you write a first draft, you have a sense of the sound of the language. But yeah, it was years of making sure that every single note was correct. And you know, there also were passages that were revised and returned to, you know, more capaciously than others. But I would say that by and large, it's the fine-tooth comb, Dave. I'm sure you know this too, as a novelist. You know, you have to attend to every sentence, you know, in sort of a singular capacity. You really have to care and nurture every sentence and study how, you know, it connects to what's come before and what's about to follow it, you know. And especially since, you know, in this novel, folks, I don't know if you could hear it from the reading, but there's some long sentences in this novel. So, you know, in some ways I was sort of writing phrasally, which is to say, like, one sentence could have like 5 meandering kind of, I don't know, passages you'd have to go through to finally reach the end of the sentence. And it's a strategy that I really admire in writers like, you know, the Hungarian novelist Laszlo Krasznahorkai. I admire it in Virginia Woolf, the sort of like the stream of consciousness method. I mean, I'm not Woolf. I can't do what Woolf does. I mean, but you know, as a novelist, you read these other voices, and, you know, you hear this kind of bell in your ear, right? And so that bell kind of stays with you. And then as you're writing, you know, you can hear just like the faintest sound. Oh, there's a little Elliot, right? Like, oh, there's a little tiny ring of Joyce, a little Wolf, you know, whatever, a little Cheever, weirdly. How'd that get in there, you know? But that comes from being a voracious reader. You know, the more you read, I think the more access you have to the sounds of language, right? You begin to, I mean, T.S. Eliot said, good writers borrow, great writers steal. And I think he meant that in sort of a sideways way, which is to say, what are you stealing? You're stealing sort of the sound of the style. But of course, you know, you've got to be careful about it. You're not writing pastiche. You know, pastiche is going to fail for all kinds of reasons. You're just.
Uh-oh. Oh, no.
Beautiful way, Dave. But I hope that gives you a little bit of a sense.
So there, another question just came in, and this is from someone named Max, and he's wondering, so, you know, so many of us who've read this book really love the choice of the second person for the Alex Wilson sections. And he's wondering why you decided to write in that second person. And was there any intention to encourage the reader to empathize with Alex Wilson? Like, was that like an intentional choice, or did it just emerge that way?
That's a great question. I mean, within that question is a little bit of a problem in fiction, which is the degree to which we actually have choice, right, over the characters that we're writing. And I think really, if you're doing your job, you are in some ways a filter for the character's desires. You should know them so well that they're just going to kind of tell you what they want and what they need. So I would say that I wasn't sitting here thinking like, oh, deliberately, now I'm going to try and find a way to empathize with this cretin. But it naturally was born out of the voice and, you know, Alex's own, you know, desires that began to appear as he became confronted with the problems of his own psyche. I mean, the way in which his habits of viewing the world became challenged with the arrival of this aardvark. So the second person actually happened very early on in the novel. I started actually trying to write in first person, and I wanted nothing to do with this character in first person. I just could not sit in that consciousness in first. I mean, maybe if I really wanted to, I could have forced it to happen. But I mean, point of view for me, I have to say, is one of the most crucial, I mean, let's use the word decision, right? It's one of the most crucial decisions you can make, but it's a decision that you know, you have to really be able to intuit, like kind of at the gut level. You have to say, this feels right. You know, I definitely work, you know, quite a bit through just like my gut reaction to various, you know, strategies of narration. So I would, you know, I started playing around with the second person. And I remember actually in that moment thinking, God, am I doing this? Am I really writing in second person? Folks, this is very rarely done in fiction writing. It's an incredibly hard point of view to write. But for some reason, you know, this piece of shit came alive in the second person. He just began to flourish. And a part of it, I think, is because I realized that I could see myself in conversation with him in second person. So there was room for both empathy and indictment. I could both kind of sympathize with what he was going through, but also really point the finger at this character and say, listen, you, your time is up. Right? So, you know, Max, I don't know if you are a fiction writer, but I would also say that sometimes just simply switching the point of view in any story that you're writing can just do a huge amount of work, you know, for you. It can suddenly make the entire story just feel somehow easier and more natural. And I would definitely trust that instinct. You know, you really can be in a position where you're fighting too hard for your fiction. And if you're in that place where you feel like you're really dying as a writer, then something's not right. You know, it really should be, you should be able to kind of, in my view, like access it in a way that just feels slightly easier, slightly more correct and ready, you know? And so, you know, play around with the point of view and see what happens for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
This was such a treat, guys. I think that we probably should wrap because it's 1 o'clock, but
yes, thank you so much.
Appreciate your time. And just a reminder to everybody that Longfellow Books has copies on hand. They'd love to get a call from you or any other bookstore, of course, that you'd like to order this book from. They can be reached at 772-4045. Oh,
thank you. I saw Linda holding up a copy. I love it.
And,
thanks, you guys. Oh, this is so great.
Yes, this was excellent. But thanks again, Kate and Jess. This was fantastic.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks, Louis. Thank you all. Thanks so much.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.